Welcome to a place where silence has weight, where breath and steel share the same rhythm. Welcome to the Western Front, 1916, where French and British soldiers were treated side by side in a British field hospital, their pain stitched together beneath a single canvas sky. June 1916. Somme Valley, northern France. Engines hot, breathless lines tied to the mud and wire. Smoke in the lungs, the stench of iron blood and rain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the guns never sleep, and the air itself seems to shiver. Inside a labyrinth of tents, the wounded arrive in waves, boots dragging stretchers, swaying eyes clouded by dust and disbelief. Engines cough. Steel vibrates. A single order cuts through the noise, sharp as a blade, cold as the wind that follows the shell fire. This is the Western Front, where life and death trade places every minute, and mercy works faster than judgment. The Red Cross flaps weakly above the tents. Nurses move between rows of cots, their aprons stiff with blood. A French lieutenant moans in his native tongue. Beside him, a British private reaches out a trembling hand. For a moment, they are not enemies, nor allies, just men caught in the same unraveling dream. A nurse whispers, "Courage." Another answers, "Hold on." Language dissolves, but compassion finds its own translation. The field hospital breathes with the rhythm of the guns, each explosion a heartbeat, each silence a fragile prayer. Before we begin, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and the exact time you're listening. What do you hear in this silence, the echo of courage or the sound of history exhaling? Because this is where nations bled together, and where humanity learned the meaning of survival beneath the thunder of war. Before the mud, before the gas, before the endless stretch of gray horizons, there was belief. Belief that the war would be short, sharp, victorious. In London, cafes and Paris boulevards, young men spoke of glory as if it were something you could pack beside a razor and a photograph. By the spring of 1916, that illusion was already dissolving in the trenches of Flanders and the Somme. The Western Front had become a wound that refused to close. Every inch of land was bought with 1,000 lives, and still the maps barely moved. The French army bled white at Verdun, was holding the line with sheer endurance. The British Expeditionary Force, swollen now with volunteers, students, miners, and clerks, prepared to take its turn. They trained in the drizzle of northern camps, boots sinking into chalk soil, repeating drills that blurred the line between discipline and despair. Each man learned to assemble a Lee Enfield rifle blindfolded. Each man learned that the difference between courage and luck was often measured in seconds. Engines of a new kind entered the field, the rumble of lorries, the throb of ambulances, the first armored carriers lumbering toward history. Behind them, logistics officers drew invisible arteries across France's supply routes that would feed both the living and the wounded. The British Army Medical Corps worked shoulder to shoulder with French medics, improvising a system that had never existed before. Portable field hospitals, mobile operating theaters, sterilization tents powered by makeshift boilers. They believed the enemy was stronger, better equipped, better entrenched, but the war was beginning to teach a crueler lesson, that timing, coordination, and endurance could flip the entire map. By the time the summer offensive was planned, the big push, they called it, every regiment, every medic, every driver knew that this time there would be no quick return. The field hospitals were built in layers behind the line, dressing stations near the trenches, clearing stations by the roads, general hospitals near the railways. But as the casualties multiplied, boundaries blurred. Surgical tables stood beside ammunition crates. Blood ran into the same mud that carried orders to the front. At Etaples, at Amiens, at Camiers, British and French units began to overlap. The wounded from both sides of the channel arrived on the same stretchers, their identification tags smeared beyond reading. The nurses adapted, learned fragments of the other's language, enough to keep a man alive long enough to be moved again. A French orderly remembered, "We spoke little. The eyes told everything. We passed instruments stitched, moved to the next. It did not matter what uniform lay beneath the bandages." The British surgeon beside him wrote in his diary that same week, "There is no nationality under chloroform." The air itself seemed to hum with exhaustion. At dawn, engines coughed to life, convoys loaded with stretchers, gasping men, crates of morphine, and letters unsent. The roads were veins pulsing with traffic, mud, and faith. The front consumed everything: fuel, food, flesh, hope, and the hospitals became the fragile lungs that kept the machine breathing. By June, when the offensive began, the first wave of wounded arrived before the reports of victory. Men were carried in by horse ambulance, by truck, by hand. Some still clutched the remnants of their rifles, others a photograph soaked through with rain. The surgeons worked until their gloves tore, until their voices failed. Out there beyond the hospital perimeter, the enemy's guns were still relentless. Shells fell with mechanical rhythm, turning every pause into a threat. Yet inside those canvas walls, the rhythm of human hands pushed back against the chaos, cutting, stitching, lifting, whispering. For the first time in this war, men from two armies, two languages, two empires shared not the front, but the recovery. In the rare quiet hours before dawn, the sound of the generators merged with the faint chorus of prayers. Someone played a harmonica. Someone else wrote a letter he knew he would never send. And in the fragile glow of lanterns, you could see the faces, French, British, young, pale, distant, breathing the same smoke, dreaming the same dream of home. What began as a war for territory had become something else entirely, a war for endurance, for the possibility of holding on to humanity while the world dissolved around them. This is the backdrop, the ground from which our story grows. The field hospital was not an afterthought of the front. It was the heart that kept the broken body of war alive. Before they ever saw the front, they learned to listen not to commands, but to rhythm. The rhythm of boots striking mud. The rhythm of breath under gas masks. The rhythm of fear pretending to be courage. In the early months of 1916, the British and French recruits trained in sprawling camps carved from northern fields, places where the drizzle never stopped, and the wind carried the sound of distant artillery like a ghostly metronome. Here, failure came first. The first attempts at coordination between the two armies were awkward commands, lost in translation units, mismatched in timing, equipment incompatible. Ambulances stalled in ditches. Medical tents collapsed under rain. Early field drills ended in chaos, the wounded mock patients left lying in mud, while officers argued over procedures. One report from a British medical officer recorded that nearly 30% of stretcher evacuations failed to reach the dressing station within the hour. It was not just a matter of distance, it was the rhythm of movement, of trust that still needed to be learned. Discipline was forged in repetition. The men drilled by day and by night, learning to move, load, lift, carry under conditions designed to mimic hell. They practiced triage by candlelight, memorized the protocols of the Royal Army Medical Corps in English and French. A French nurse learned the English words for pulse pressure pain. A British orderly memorized the French verbs for breathe, hold, live. Within weeks, phrases of both languages blurred into one language of survival. By February, the training camps near Etaples and Boulogne began to resemble miniature cities, warehouses stacked with medical kits, trucks lined up like arteries of steel. Each day, an average of 120 ambulance runs practiced the route from mock trench to field station. The logistics officers timed everything: fuel at 2 gallons per mile, casualty load, up to 6 men per vehicle, response window under 60 minutes. Failure to meet the mark meant starting again. For the infantry, the training was no gentler. The British newcomers, often barely out of school, were drilled alongside French veterans hardened from Verdun. They learned trench navigation, night signaling, and the deadly arithmetic of timing artillery with infantry advance. But what set this phase apart was the introduction of medical coordination as part of combat training itself. Soldiers were taught not only to fight, but to retrieve, to dress wounds in the open, to carry comrades through shellfire, to recognize the early symptoms of gas poisoning. The lesson was cruel, but necessary. Survival depended not only on killing the enemy, but on saving your own. Every mistake, every delay became a number written in the cold ink of casualty reports. The technology itself was a teacher. The new motorized ambulances, heavy, cumbersome, prone to stalling in mud, forced the crews to adapt. Drivers learned to shift gears with surgical precision, to steer through shell-cratered roads without headlights. The engines drank 8 gallons of fuel per hour when loaded, a figure that haunted every quartermaster's report. Mechanics worked beside surgeons, their hands equally stained with grease and blood. Both were learning to keep men alive, one through steel, the other through flesh. By March, the field hospitals underwent simulated bombardments to test readiness. Alarms sounded without warning. Lanterns were doused. Teams worked in near darkness. Surgeons timed amputations against the sound of detonations. Nurses learned to duck instinctively when the canvas walls rippled from shockwaves. In one account, Sister Evelyn Ford wrote, "We were told to treat every thunder as the guns to stitch faster when the ground shook. It became a reflex, like breathing. It was not only about skill, it was about endurance. Each man and woman at the front had to learn the limits of fatigue. Training schedules ran 18 hours a day with only brief pauses for sleep. Rations were reduced to mimic scarcity. Letters were withheld for weeks to teach emotional detachment. You cannot break in battle what has already been broken." In training, a French colonel remarked, and his words became prophecy. Amid the drills, bonds began to form, quiet, unspoken, stronger than uniform or flag. British medics shared cigarettes with French stretcher-bearers. Mechanics swapped tools. Nurses shared boiled water for coffee. It was in those small gestures that unity began to take shape, not the kind that was ordered, but the kind that was earned. The failures became lessons. The lessons became rhythm. The rhythm became trust. And trust, that invisible thread, became the only constant when the war refused to offer any others. By May, when orders came to move toward the Somme, the units could operate blindfolded. A team of 4 could stabilize a wounded man in under 90 seconds. A convoy could be assembled and dispatched in 10 minutes. Communication drills, once chaotic, now ran like clockwork, 1 whistle for load 2, for move 3, for incoming. They had turned chaos into choreography. Yet beneath the precision, there lingered a quiet fear, a collective knowing that no amount of preparation could truly prepare them for what awaited beyond the wire. The men packed their gear in silence. Nurses rolled bandages until their fingers blistered. Mechanics checked engines again and again, as if one more turn of the wrench could make fate itself more reliable. When dawn came, the camp stirred like a single breathing body, steam rising from engines, breath misting from horses, boots striking mud in unison. Orders were given in both tongues, and for the first time no one needed translation. They moved as one, British and French, into the gray horizon that swallowed all sound but the heartbeat of the war. It was not victory they trained for. It was endurance. And endurance on the Western Front would soon mean something far beyond survival. The morning air was thick with fog and gunpowder, a gray smear that blurred horizon and trench alike. Engines coughed and wheezed as convoys of ambulances rumbled forward, carrying stretchers already weighted with the first casualties. The Somme lay before them, an endless tapestry of churned mud, shattered wire, and the skeletal remains of once lush farmland. Trees were stumps. Houses were ruins. Every yard of ground seemed claimed by the earth itself, scarred by artillery and soaked with rain. The first contact was sudden, a volley that cut the morning quiet into jagged fragments. British and French forward units pressed into the advance, exchanged brief signals over static-filled radios. 0 hour reached. Proceed with caution. Heavy fire at Sector C-12, the British officer reported, voice clipped and mechanical. French counterparts replied in hurried tones, confirming coordinates and casualty expectations. Each signal was a thread in a fragile tapestry that could unravel in seconds. The terrain itself conspired against them. Shell craters became impromptu moats, mud suctioning boots and stretchers alike. The British infantry crawled forward, rifles raised, faces smeared with chalk dust and fear. French units flanked on either side, sending scouts through the shattered wheat fields, their eyes scanning for movement that might indicate the enemy's position. By mid-morning, the first wave of wounded began trickling back, carried by stretcher-bearers whose muscles ached from the relentless terrain. Each trip averaged 2 to 3 minutes longer than planned, the mud and debris slowing progress, yet every man moved with precise discipline, learned from months of training. The first artillery barrage broke over the northern sector, sending a concussion through the ground and shaking tents at the rear. Field hospitals erupted into organized chaos. Nurses and medics anticipated arrivals with near telepathic timing. Triage tables were set in a rhythm: check, pulse, assess limb damage, apply tourniquet, record name or number. By noon, over 130 casualties had passed through the tents, a mixture of French and British soldiers, their uniforms indistinguishable beneath blood and mud. Ambulances were dispatched, continuously carrying men back from the front line to clearing stations and then on to general hospitals. Every vehicle had a number fuel consumed. Men carried time to delivery. Efficiency was measured down to the minute, yet each figure could never capture the human cost of a fractured leg or a perforated lung. Radio operators crouched in dugouts or behind sandbags relayed updates continuously. Static hissed between languages, coordinates, and emergency codes. One operator noted in his log sector B9 under fire incoming wounded, 47 need stretcher reinforcement and repeat, 47 wounded. Engineers adjusted telegraph wires and portable generators maintaining the fragile lifeline between forward units and the medical rear. Every message was a pulse in the machine of war, a lifeline that could save lives if interpreted correctly. Advances and retreats were measured in yards. Enemy positions shifted with cunning patience. The first British assault stalled against barbed wire and hidden machine guns. French artillery adjusted on request, firing in measured salvos to suppress defensive fire. By mid-afternoon, the casualty count had surged to nearly 250 men, the wounded flowing like a river back to field hospitals. Stretcher bearers, often carrying the weight of 2 men in a single trip, navigated trenches slick with blood and rainwater. Exhaustion mounted, yet every movement was orchestrated, a choreography honed through countless drills. Amid the chaos, personal acts of courage became the unspoken backbone of the operation. A young British private lifted a French comrade over a barbed wire entanglement, ignoring shrapnel tearing through the air around them. A French nurse dragged a stretcher through shellfire, shouting instructions in English to medics who could barely keep pace. Every micro-action added to the collective rhythm, ensuring that despite the carnage, lives were saved. Terrain challenges were relentless. The northern fields, once cultivated with wheat and barley, had become a morass of mudshell craters and water-filled depressions. Horses struggled to pull ambulances, wheels sinking with each turn. Vehicles stalled, requiring teams of men to push, pull, and heave under the glare of intermittent sunlight. Supply routes were congested with wounded equipment and the remnants of destroyed vehicles. Communications units rerouted lines, continuously improvising connections to maintain a lifeline between front line and medical rear. By late afternoon, the dynamic of the engagement began to show its swing. Initial gains in Sector A5 were reversed under unexpected enemy counterfire. Radios crackled with reports of shifting front lines, hold positions, reinforcements en route, repeat reinforcements en route. Casualty estimates rose exponentially. The field hospitals adjusted tents, were expanded tables, added extra surgeons called from reserve. The flow of men did not slow, it intensified. The wounded arrived in groups, sometimes 40 at a time, requiring immediate decisions, prioritize critical injuries, stabilize fractures, administer morphine, document, move on. Despite the overwhelming scale, a rhythm emerged. Orders passed seamlessly from officers to medics. Drivers knew the quickest path through shell-cratered roads. Nurses anticipated injuries, surgeons adapted on the fly. Technology and training intersected, field radios guided ambulance convoys, maps directed stretcher teams, and manual logs ensured records survived the chaos. Each number, whether units per day, loss rate, fuel per mile, became part of a larger equation, a quantifiable measure of survival in an otherwise chaotic environment. By evening, the first day of the offensive had reached its grim equilibrium. Casualties continued to flow, but the field hospitals had found their pace. Reports indicated approximately 480 wounded had been treated, their lives preserved by a combination of preparation, courage, and sheer endurance. The ebb and flow of battle, advance, retreat, bombardment, rescue had been mirrored inside the hospital tents. The reality of war had collided with months of training, producing a system that could absorb shock and adapt in real time. As twilight fell, stretchers still lined the corridors, nurses still worked without pause, and radio operators transmitted final updates before the generators were shut down for the night. The mud, the smoke, the constant percussion of artillery had forged a day of survival and coordination unlike any previous campaign. Soldiers, medics, and drivers alike understood, not in theory, but in the aching muscles and bloodied hands, that the first day's success depended on rhythm, trust, and relentless adaptation. This was Combat Phase 1, where planning met the unforgiving realities of the Western Front, where terrain dictated pace, radios dictated order, and every number, every calculation measured the fine line between life and death. By the day's end, it was clear that survival was not random. It was earned in sweat, mud, and the steady hands of men and women who had been trained to endure, to adapt, and to act decisively when the world itself seemed to collapse around them. The morning opened with the same gray drizzle, yet the air carried a different weight, tension sharpened like a knife. The first day had tested the rhythm, the coordination, the fragile trust between British and French units. Now the second day demanded instinct and split-second decisions where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. At Sector C-14, a shell burst overhead, throwing mud and splintered wood into the air. A British corporal froze for a fraction of a second, the decision: dive into the nearest crater or push forward to drag a wounded French private out of the line of fire. That fraction of a second became a lifetime. He chose action. His hands burned as he hauled the soldier, slipping in the mud, gasping for breath, feeling the throb of adrenaline against every nerve. Behind them, the trench erupted with chaos, artillery pounding, machine guns, rattling screams punctuating the rhythm of survival. Across the field, a French lieutenant faced a similar choice. A British ambulance attempting a precarious turn through shell-cratered mud stalled. The men inside groaned, blood spilling over splints and bandages. The lieutenant ran, signaling for volunteers, calculating that a delay of even 20 seconds could overwhelm the fragile system of triage. Together, they pushed the ambulance free, hearts hammering, sleeves soaked in rain and blood. The trust forged in training now became instinct. Every advance and retreat repeated motifs from the previous day, chaos tempered by coordination, fear mitigated by experience, life preserved by unspoken rhythm. Yet the cost was visible, written in flesh and scarred canvas. A young private, barely 20, cradled a shattered arm and a letter soaked through with mud. A note to his mother never sent a reminder of home that would now remain unread. Nearby, a mechanic etched a hastily written log into the margin of his field repair notebook, detailing the ambulance engine that had died under fire. The tires ripped, the fuel drained, the time lost, small acts of documentation that mirrored the care for human life. Losses mounted despite skill and preparation. By midday, 52 casualties had been added to the tally, each carried with urgency back to the field hospital. The tents seemed to grow heavier with each stretcher, each groan, each whispered plea. Nurses repeated their motions, tourniquet dressing morphine over and over their arms, trembling but unyielding. Surgeons saw the same wounds on different bodies, a grim motif echoing across the day: shrapnel in the chest, fractured legs, gas-induced burns. And each repetition was a rehearsal in resilience. In the trenches, men began to recognize the rhythm of danger. Machine gun fire swept across no man's land. Shells fell in unpredictable arcs. Decisions came in microseconds: when to crawl, when to lift, when to call the radio for extraction. At one point, a British medic shouted over the din, "Hold him, I've got him," as he dragged a French soldier behind a collapsed wall, blood soaking the sleeve of his tunic. The moment was fleeting, yet seared into memory, emblematic of the repeated motif of bravery under fire. Amid the carnage, personal scars emerged. A corporal bore a jagged cut along his temple, the result of a falling splinter from a nearby shell explosion. He pressed a handkerchief to it, eyes scanning for more wounded. A French private, coughing through the effects of gas exposure, clutched a small notebook, scribbling coordinates and messages to relay later, each entry a testament to the tension between survival and duty. The motif of repeated sacrifice, the relentless grind of combat, was embodied in every torn uniform, every call for help, every calculated risk. The field hospital mirrored the front. Stretcher bearers arrived in waves, ambulances lined up, and tents filled to capacity. Nurses moved like shadows, each action deliberate, rehearsed, almost automatic. Triage tables bore witness to the repetition of injuries, the predictability of war distilled into human fragility. Yet within this repetition lay a strange form of control, a way to impose order on chaos. Each bandage, each morphine injection, each recorded vital sign was a thread holding the fabric of the day together. By late afternoon, exhaustion had set in. The rhythm remained, but fatigue slowed the edge of decision-making. Radios crackled with urgency. Sector D3 need evacuation. Repeat evacuation now. Generators hummed, engines choked, wheels sank in mud. Soldiers, medics, and drivers operated on instinct alone. A field report would later record that the ambulance convoy had achieved an average of 8 units per hour under fire, an extraordinary feat considering terrain and weather conditions. Every number was a shadow of the human effort behind it, yet necessary to quantify survival. And then a sudden lull. The artillery ceased briefly, and for a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed suspended in time. The soldiers glimpsed each other across the mud, British and French eyes meeting in recognition, silent acknowledgement of shared hardship. Letters, logs, and scars told stories that no official report could capture. They were reminders that the war was more than maps and orders. It was personal, intimate, and devastatingly human. The final hours of the day reinforced the motif that had defined the conflict. So far, repeated decisions under pressure, repeated acts of courage, repeated losses, mitigated by training and trust. As night fell, tents still held, the wounded lanterns glowed weakly, and stretcher bearers rested briefly before returning to the mud-soaked roads. Surgeons signed off on their logs, noting the treatments given, the injuries sustained, and the lives preserved. Scarred faces, letters clutched in hands, and repair notebooks reflected a duality: destruction and preservation, chaos and rhythm, fear and endurance. Combat Phase 2 had tested every lesson, every muscle memory, every trust that had been cultivated in training. Split-second decisions had become lifelines. Motifs of injury, courage, and resilience had repeated across the landscape and inside the tents. Personal costs: a scar across a temple, a letter never sent, a repair log entry detailing survival against the odds, underscored the human dimension of the battle. By the day's end, the soldiers understood more clearly than ever that the war was not just fought with rifles and artillery, but with the quiet, repeated acts that preserved life amidst devastation. This climax, the collision of preparation and unpredictability, left a mark not only on the land, but on every man and woman who had endured it. The motifs of sacrifice, split-second judgment, and repeated courage would echo long after the guns fell silent. The scars, letters, and logs would remain tangible reminders that survival in the Western Front was earned, recorded, and remembered in every heartbeat and every hand extended to another. The guns had fallen silent for the moment, leaving behind a landscape carved in mud and memory. Trenches gaped like open wounds, barbed wire twisted and broken, and the somber rhythm of footsteps through mud replaced the deafening pulse of artillery. Field hospitals hummed with the quiet aftermath, stretchers still lined the aisles. Nurses cataloged treatments and surgeons tallied results from the day's relentless operation. Every casualty, every injury, every life preserved or lost was accounted for, transformed into numbers, reports, and painstaking records. By the end of the second day, the tally revealed both the cost and the resilience of those who had endured. Over 600 wounded had been treated across the British and French field hospitals, each patient a testament to coordination training and the improvisation demanded by war. Ambulance crews had completed an average of 10 trips per hour, navigating shell-cratered roads and mud-choked paths. Fuel logs recorded over 500 gallons consumed, each liter stretched across the fragile arteries of survival. Every statistic concealed a human story, a body saved by timing, by skill, by the split-second intuition of a medic or a driver. Repairs became a metaphor for the day itself. Ambulances broken under the strain of repeated trips were hastily patched by mechanics whose hands were as steady as any surgeon's. Stretchers splintered under weight tents, tore in the wind, radios fell silent until rewired by operators who worked by feel as much as instruction. Every repair was a lesson in resourcefulness, a quiet demonstration that survival depended as much on ingenuity as on bravery. Even the human body required repair: splints, applied limbs, stabilized infections, controlled vitals, monitored. The act of repairing became ritualized, part of the rhythm that had carried them through the battlefield. Yet the fine line between luck and skill remained unmistakable. A shell landing inches away, a sudden collapse of a trench, a misjudged turn of a vehicle, all could have tipped the day from preservation into catastrophe. Many moments hinged not solely on training, but on fortune: the precise trajectory of shrapnel, the timing of reinforcements, the weather shifting just enough to provide cover. Leadership had to navigate this balance to recognize when to rely on drills, when to trust instincts, and when to embrace the unpredictable. Commanders from lieutenants to captains learned that authority alone could not dictate outcomes. It was empathy, observation, and decisiveness that saved lives. The lessons for leadership were manifold. Orders needed clarity and brevity. Radios had to carry commands unbroken through static, and officers had to anticipate not only the movement of men and machines, but the intangible currents of fear and exhaustion that coursed through their ranks. Leaders who hesitated, who doubted the rhythm cultivated through training, found themselves powerless to prevent loss. Those who acted decisively, calculating yet flexible, could steer both individual lives and the larger operation through chaos. The field hospital itself became a crucible for leadership, where nurses and medics exercised authority over triage and treatment, coordinating with officers to ensure that every decision served the greater goal of survival. Reflection after the battle revealed the intertwined nature of human and mechanical effort. Ambulances, radios, stretchers, and tents were only as effective as the people operating them. Trust forged through repeated drills and shared peril proved indispensable. The soldiers and medics who had relied on each other, who had internalized a rhythm of action and reaction, demonstrated a cohesion that outstripped formal rank. Coordination, timing, and skill could mitigate risk, but no plan could fully negate the randomness of war. Survival, it seemed, was a product of preparation, meeting opportunity, discipline, meeting circumstance, and courage meeting necessity. In the quiet hours of evening, officers walked through the field hospitals, observing rows of patients, noting recoveries, and reflecting on the day's triumphs and failures. They recorded the outcomes of procedures, the functionality of vehicles, the efficiency of supply lines. These reflections were not abstract. They informed the next day's operations, improved protocols, and subtly reshaped the strategies of both the British and French units. The war, in its merciless repetition, provided a relentless teacher: every injury, every casualty, every successful extraction, a lesson etched into collective memory. Personal stories surfaced amidst the data. A British corporal traced the jagged scar along his arm, a mark left by a shell fragment. He had survived, thinking of the letters he would now write, home letters that would carry the narrative of survival and the reality of endurance. A French private carefully folded the torn pages of a field notebook, recording coordinates and times, a microcosm of accountability amidst the chaos. These individual threads reinforced the broader pattern that history is preserved not only in numbers but in scars, in logs, in the enduring memory of those who bore witness. Ultimately, the aftermath revealed that the war was about more than maps, objectives, and territorial gains. It was about the capacity of humans to endure, to adapt, to repair both machine and flesh under duress. Skill mattered, yes, the drills, the coordination, the preparation, but luck and circumstance shaped outcomes in ways that could not be rehearsed. Leadership mattered not for glory, but for the lives it could save through insight, decisiveness, and trust. And reflection mattered because understanding the interplay of these forces allowed lessons to be preserved, shared, and applied in moments to come. As night fell, lanterns cast long shadows across the mud, illuminating faces etched with exhaustion and resolve. Nurses, soldiers, and drivers alike moved in the dim light, performing small acts that bridged the gap between survival and despair. Engines rested, radios went silent, and the quiet allowed for the recognition that each life saved had been a triumph of preparation, courage, and human ingenuity. The tally of casualties, the repaired vehicles, the maps annotated with timings, all were tangible evidence of an effort that transcended mere strategy. In one line, the thesis of this reflection emerges. Survival on the Western Front depended as much on preparation, coordination, and trust as on firepower, and its lessons extend beyond the battlefield into leadership, human endurance, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. The guns have long fallen silent, yet their echo persists, etched into doctrine hospitals and the memory of every soldier who survived. The lessons of the Western Front, the Somme, the mud, the relentless rhythm of injury and triage shaped modern military medicine and operational coordination. Field hospitals became blueprints for future conflict, demonstrating that survival relied on integration of training, logistics, and human judgment as much as on weaponry. The practices refined in those tense, rapid triage mobile evacuation, cross-national cooperation, influenced post-war protocols setting a precedent for armies around the world. Leadership, too, was redefined. Officers learned that authority alone could not save lives. Empathy, foresight, and the ability to adapt under extreme pressure were indispensable. These lessons carried beyond military application, informing organizational theory, emergency response planning, and even civilian medical infrastructure. Trust and coordination honed in the chaos of combat became principles applied in peacetime, reinforcing the notion that disciplined preparation paired with human judgment is universally critical. The scars of war, both literal and metaphorical, endured. Veterans carried memories and injuries into communities, shaping the social fabric of post-war Europe. Letters preserved in archives, field repair logs, and medical reports became evidence not just of the conflict's brutality, but of its meticulous management. Each document, each record bears witness to the resilience and adaptability of humans confronted by relentless adversity. The motif repeats across history: preparation meets chaos, skill confronts randomness, courage intersects with survival. Today, the legacy of those field hospitals and frontline decisions continues to resonate. Modern emergency medicine, disaster response, and battlefield care trace their lineage to practices developed amid mud smoke and shattered terrain. Coordination between multinational teams, rapid deployment of mobile units, and meticulous record-keeping, all innovations born of necessity in 1916, remain essential strategies. The human stories preserved alongside statistics remind us that behind every protocol, every tactical decision, is a life whose survival depended on rhythm, trust, and split-second judgment. The Western Front also teaches a broader cultural lesson that the boundaries between nations blur when humanity is at stake. French and British soldiers side by side in tents endured together. Their cooperation under fire offers a timeless model for collaboration beyond politics and borders, a lesson echoed in international humanitarian work, joint military operations, and shared medical responses to crisis. In that context, the Somme is more than a battle. It is a laboratory of human resilience and ingenuity. As we reflect, it becomes clear that history's value lies not in spectacle, but in evidence. The preserved logs, letters, and reports provide insight into decisions, mistakes, and triumphs, allowing us to understand the mechanics of survival and leadership. This is the enduring impact, the ability to learn from the past, to apply those lessons in new contexts, and to honor the human effort that shaped outcomes. Subscribe for archival-based stories, evidence over sensationalism. Witness the threads of history woven through scars, letters, and logs, and consider how decisions made under unimaginable pressure continue to inform our understanding of resilience today. The Western Front. 1916 remains more than a battlefield. It is a testament to human endurance, to the careful orchestration of preparation and adaptability, and to the enduring importance of empathy and leadership when the stakes are highest.